some of the important ingredients that can create thriving schools. And what I mean by that is ensuring the promise that public education can have, particularly for students of color, to transcend their circumstances, means that we can't take on that work alone. That work has to be in collaboration with what we call stakeholders, but what we mean is families, with community leaders, with community-based partnerships, with folks who are also committed to the success of its community. And when you walked in this evening, you may have picked up, I wanted to make sure you had a takeaway this evening, what is the product of a year's worth of work with our community. It's a new community-defined vision for our students, Portland Public Schools Reimagined, and some of what the students, educators, and community members who participated spoke clearly about some of the skills and dispositions that their hopes were there for our graduates. And it's not what you might typically expect as an outcome. It describes in the graduate portrait that our students will be empathetic, that they will be global stewards, that they will have a connected sense of self, that they'll be lifelong learners, that they'll be racial equity leaders. But we took it 2 steps further. We said we actually can't produce a graduate like this unless we also focus on the educators. And we don't want to just put the responsibility for achieving that kind of a graduate portrait just on our students or our educators, because it implies that there also has to be some system shifts.
So what I want to address today is this idea that successful education requires meeting the needs of the whole child through the lens of equity. And I really highlighted kind of 6 areas that I think are garnering attention in our school district. This first is systemic systems of support. Our students are coming to us today with some significant challenges. Trauma, many of our students are at risk. We know that Oregon has one of the highest suicide rates for youth in the country. And so as a school system, we need to be determining how we provide counseling and mental health support to our students. Social emotional learning, family resource centers, and student-based health centers are critical for the success of our students. Teacher support and development. We know nationally that 50% of new teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years. That is not a great return on that investment. And so how do we support new teachers and how do we develop new teachers is critical, I believe, for the success of public education today. What we know is that a student's gender and their skin color, their home language, and their parents' income level continues to be the predictor of who graduates and who doesn't graduate from our school systems. And we must have a commitment to the success of each student, every single one of them. And this requires us to have intentional action that identifies and removes barriers to student success. Right? And so when we know that, it really becomes clear for us on what's our why. Our why and our work has to be about the development of the human being. It's about ensuring that when students leave us, that they have the opportunity for social uplift. It's about giving them a voice in this world, and it's about them being empowered to claim their humanity. And in North Clackamas, our equity work has really been driven on these key areas. We know that if students have teachers that look like them, they're more likely to graduate from that school system. Our professional development must be deeply embedded in equity, particularly race-based equity, and helping our staff and our community understand the impacts that race have on student achievement. We need to look at detracking our systems and which students are we setting up for success and which students are we not setting up for success. Finally, we need to look at the implementation of culturally responsive pedagogy. Culturally relevant pedagogy is really grounded by 3 pillars. Those pillars are academic achievement, cultural competence, and social political consciousness. And when we look at each one of those, I'll try to define it for you a little bit more clearly. That first pillar of academic achievement, it really leads to demonstrable growth in required subjects that teachers are focused on academic mastery. We must have a belief, our teachers need to have a belief that all students can and must experience a rigorous academic program. That teachers need to know their content, they must know their learner, and they must know how to teach the content to the learner. They must think deeply about what they teach, why they are teaching it, what resources they're using to teach it, and how they're going to teach it based upon who their students are as people and learners. The second pillar is cultural competence. And this is a firm grounding in one's culture while learning, while also acquiring fluency in at least one additional culture. Students must have command of cultural competence, the ability to understand their own cultural identities and lenses and to interact effectively with others who are different from them. Cultural competence requires that teachers understand their own cultural backgrounds and actively learn about those backgrounds of their students. In doing so, teachers not only affirm their students' lived experiences, but also empower their students by using their students' culture as the basis for learning. When cultural competence is played out as it should, students feel respected and affirmed in their multiple identities, and here's the key: in return, respect and affirm the multiple identities of others. And finally, pillar number 3 is social political consciousness. This is the ability to use school knowledge to solve relevant social, cultural, civic, environmental, and political problems, or the ability to answer, why do we have to learn this? Students must develop critical consciousness that allows them to challenge the status quo of the current social order. With support, students can turn awareness into power. And when we implement these pillars of cultural pedagogy effectively and with fidelity, we move beyond majority rules.
First and foremost, 3 to PhD really is a microcosm of what you both just explained, and in particular, 3 to PhD, without the support of the superintendent and the approval of the Portland Public Schools School Board, we wouldn't be able to operate operationally. You know, I can tell you that Kaiser Permanente coming on board as a partner, they brought full medical and full dental inside that school, and we're up to about a 25% usage rate right now of families. We have Trillium Family Services that's a partner in this. We have 2 full-time mental health therapists who saw up to 15% of the student body last year. Basics Food Market Club, but that store accepts food stamps, it accepts WIC, it provides organic and healthy food options. That store is available to not only Fabian students and their families, but also Concordia, the college students. The second mission, in addition to wrapping around the Fabian students, is the mission of developing teachers. So the College of Education, and this really what sets us apart from a lot of other models across the country. The College of Education is co-located inside the school. So on the 3 floors of the school, you have college students who are studying to be educators and teachers on those same floors. So you'll see a freshman who wants to be a teacher one day walking to class at the same time as a first grader.
Welcome to 3 to PhD. Babies. Cafeteria. Gym. Playground.
it's really hard to wrap your brains around this new facility that houses everything that you saw in that video. And so to show the video to those who haven't had the opportunity to visit the school is really the only way to give you an idea of what 3 to PhD looks like on the inside. All the educators in the room knows this is the instructional core, and the tighter this triangle can be, the more student learning goes up. And we know every district, every principal, every classroom teacher is working to tighten this triangle. So 3 to PhD wraps itself through that instructional core. We have that opportunity to talk about the top of that triangle, the teacher. We have the opportunity to talk about teacher development. We have the opportunity to talk about the student at the corner of that. And obviously, reducing, lowering food insecurity, increasing access to healthcare, mental health services really helps with how students are showing up. And then the curriculum side, we have an opportunity to really support the school in its efforts to develop STEAM education and problem-based learning.
So when I think about innovation, I think about communities. And I think about how are we using our communities to lean in to the things that need to happen for kids. I so appreciate educators and leaders that are committed to equity. And equity is an action, not just a word. Equity is having the tough conversations and wrapping around the people of color that are working in the schools to help them feel safe so that they can reach the kids. We want kids to know. We want them to know how to be critical thinkers and how to be problem solvers. Why can't we do that in the community? The area of math is a barrier for us. Now, it's a barrier because it predicts whether students are going to go to post-secondary. So, for instance, if you look at the ODE state report card on page 25 through 29, you will see that our 11th graders last year, 34.4, passed math. Our 6th to 8th graders, 41%. Our 3rd to 5th graders, 43.7%. Our goal, and it said long-term goal, is 80%. And if you are a minority student or a special ed student, you're way lower. If we took one standard of critical thinking for one of the little classes over at Fabian, or for the whole city, and we all leaned in to whatever kid we knew, and we worked on it. We looked at them developmentally. Are their eyes tracking? Well, if their eyes are not tracking, they can't read. We don't check that. Is their movement okay? All of these things that we don't check around development, if we looked at that and everyone in this room and in the city leaned in on one standard, I bet you we'd move that dial in math. I think innovation is communities, not just communities in the schools, communities out of the schools, leaning in to really know what's going on in our schools and for our families. Thank you.
So what's innovative is to actually be attentive to the needs of every student. And so it's not that we don't know how to teach reading, but why is it that not every student, particularly those of darker complexion, often aren't literate? How do we really look at our work through a racial equity lens where we expect to see every one of our students successful?
That ability to understand one's culture, one's experiences, as well as those of others, and then being able to use that to help transform their outcome.
That when students are understood, and when students are accepted, and when students have a sense of belonging, that's when they can learn.
Lots of pre-K and kindergartners who like to say, that's not fair. And that means what they're telling us is that they want to participate. And oftentimes, instead of tell me more about that, that turns into sit down and be quiet. And then that, the trajectory for that student who wants to just question and know more about their purpose and what's happening to them sometimes is looked upon as insubordination. And too many of our kids that aren't ready to walk in a straight line or sit on the carpet totally, and are incredibly bright, just they get the wrong message about who they are as learners and people, and we got to do a better job.
Sometimes we just don't understand the developmental underpinnings of kids. So what are kids communicating to us, and are we pushing them past thresholds? But I don't think that we look deep enough into development and antecedents of what's really going on with kids.
And then not only do we have to talk about curriculum and instructional pedagogy, but the work as educators very much had to talk about not just the cultural responsiveness by which we do our work, but how do we recognize, understand, address, and support those traumas that can exhibit themselves. We increasingly see that with housing instability, with addiction, with interrupted schooling, that these behaviors are becoming increasingly a part of the challenges that our schools need to think about.
I have until this year, I had a middle school where it was a 1 to 600 ratio for a counselor to students. Right. What the national accreditation says for counseling services, I think, is one counselor to 250 students. We have addiction issues in our country, in the opioid crisis. We have, homeless issues and affordable housing issues. Our families need support. Our kids, our students are with us for 6.5 hours a day, and then where do they go for the remaining, 18 hours of their day? And we've got to figure out in our country and in our community and in our state how we're supporting our families. Looking at early learning efforts, it would be wonderful if we could become a state that actually provides preschool for every single child in our state. Would be fantastic, and give our students a heads up on kindergarten and a step forward in kindergarten, I think, will be critical as well.
And then lastly, what I wonder about is we talked about students, and I've heard trauma-informed care, but our teachers also need the same kind of support that our students need. They are continually showing up, and they have their own trauma, and sometimes that's what shows up in school. So a lot of my work in the future will be to wrap around school systems, including the organization, looking for gaps, teachers, students, and families.
Something that guided me through my career was that I never met a student that didn't want to be successful. I never met a teacher that didn't want to be successful with students, and I never met a parent that didn't want the best for their kids. Because if we want their best on any kind of standardized test, their best in school, their best in sports, their best in the arts, they got to feel like they belong and that they are a part of the school, the community.
I think we are at a critical moment in which we can take these new investments and use them like we have not used them in the past, to affirm the identity of our students, to create belonging in our school systems, to create those deep roots in our students where they're going to be able to transform our society. And we're going to do that by teacher support, at least that you referenced. Teachers are the most critical components of our system, and they need just as much support as our students do. And along with that, how do we bring our families and our community into these conversations and become these communities that we've all talked about tonight, making sure that every voice is heard in our community and every voice is part of the decision-making process.
Our task is really to help our students find their voice, discover their gifts, their talents, and to cultivate those. Let's create the conditions for every one of our students to have that kind of experience that will enable them to be the leaders of tomorrow.